I need everyone to be honest for a moment. Who here has ever said to themselves, I really need to start going to the gym. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up early and I'll go to the gym. Yeah, we've all been there. How many of us have woken up that morning and didn't go? It's all too familiar. In this one sentence, we've captured two key aspects of behavioral science. One is what we refer to as temporal discounting. The cost of doing something today seems quite high, and so we tend to push things to tomorrow. It seems a little cheaper, a little easier to do it tomorrow. And the second one is the action-intention gap. We have these good intentions to take that action. We have some motivation to take that action, but for some reason, there's some sort of barrier or gap that prevents us from taking it. And this is particularly true when we think about sustainability and sustainable behaviors. We have over 90% of people reporting that this is something that they do feel that matters and something that does need to happen, but only about 10% of people actually report regularly taking that action. My name is Max Stanley. I am a behavioral scientist. I've spent the past 10 to 15 years working with Fortune 500s, with startups, with governments, looking at ever-complex behavioral problems. Today, I want us to look at what is behavioral science exactly? I want to look at how that connects to sustainability. And importantly, I want to give you a few tools that you can go away with today and be behavioral scientists in your own organizations and use these to be change leaders. So firstly, what is behavioral science? Well, in its simplest term, it's simply the study of how we make decisions under constraints. And it touches on a whole gambit of different areas. But importantly, it identifies that when we make decisions, we don't do so perfectly. We're not perfectly rational people. We tend to get influenced by a whole array of things. Things like our mood. Think about the decisions you make when you're hungry versus when you're full. Context is hugely important. A decision that you might make in one aspect of your life or in one area can be completely different in another. And finally, framing. How we put forth that decision, how it's put forth to you, the context of it, the framing of it, how it's perceived and how you experience it is as important as the content of that decision itself. Let me highlight this. If I was to give you a choice between an all-inclusive holiday to France or an all-inclusive holiday to Italy, one costs $400, the other also costs $400, it's a straight, which do I prefer? Do I prefer France or do I prefer Italy? If I add another option for France, again, still $400, but this time it's only half board. Not all of your meals and food and everything is included. It is objectively a much worse option, and so we quite, appropriately just forget about it. We don't think it. It's still that choice between France and Italy, but the introduction of that third worse option makes that first France option look so much more attractive. Somehow it's become more valuable. And we go from this shift of about 50-50 to about 2/3 of people choosing that original French option. All this is to say that how we perceive something, the experience that we have, is as important as the solution itself. This is an area that we have typically kind of fallen short of within sustainability. We've had such a strong focus on the engineering solution, the technical solution. We sometimes forget that there is a human in that system, and we need to think about how we design for them. To highlight this as well, I want to introduce Rory Sutherland. And I want you to think about what it means to be rich. Now, for some of you, you might think, oh, well, if I was simply to earn X amount, I would be rich, I would be wealthy. For others, you might think, well, if my cost of living is this, and I want this sort of lifestyle, you're starting to take context into account. You're being smart, you're thinking like a behavioral scientist. Rory Sutherland has another definition for it. He defines it as a rich man is anyone who earns more than his wife's sister's husband. And what he means by this is, no matter how much you earn, if you're not earning more than your sister-in-law's partner, you're never going to hear the bloody end of it, and you're not going to feel particularly wealthy at all. Context and the experience matter. So how does all of this relate to sustainability? Well, sustainability actually began life as a behavioral change intervention. It bore out of the late 70s oil crisis in the US. It was Jimmy Carter sat in front of the fire wearing his red little cardigan, asking people to reduce their energy use. More recently, we've had the UN General Secretary state that behavioral science and behavioral change is a core tenet of the kind of UN 2.0 going forward. They began to identify that action-intention gap that we talked about at the start and noticed how the speed of uptake of some of these programs, the impact of some of these programs, was now coming to a bottleneck of the human in that system, the behavior that happens in that system. So what do we mean by that? Well, you might have the best technical solution in the world, and we do have all of the solutions really available to us now to solve some of these climate problems. But if you don't think about the behavior, if you don't think about the human in the context, you will remain having that barrier to adoption. On the other side of it, once you have that adoption beginning to happen, again, that human psychology is going to be the thing that dictates the pace in which these changes happen. But with this, there is an opportunity, because whilst we have these, seemingly irrational ways in which we make these choices and the behaviors that we exhibit, we do so predictably. We understand the dynamics that are at play. We understand the biases that exist. We understand the heuristics that we use, the shortcuts that we use in these circumstances. And if we start to think about the business objectives that we have, or the sustainability objectives that we have, and we define them as the behavioral components that exist within it, we can leverage behavioral science and our understanding of these to really maximize the impact of the programs that you develop. So why do those good intentions fail? Well, here's just a short list of some of those pieces. We mentioned before that temporal discounting, that idea of we'll do it tomorrow, it'll be easier or cheaper to do tomorrow. We have an inverse of this as well. We have what we refer to as the present bias, and also the status quo bias. And that is, there tends to be a great deal of inertia to what we're doing right now. There needs to be an external signal somehow just to give us that initial piece of motivation. And a lot of the times that can be a social dynamic. That can be seeing a friend take that action. Or maybe it's a messenger. Maybe it is an authority figure kind of providing that greasing of the tracks as such. This is a great place where policy can play a role. So as we kind of wrap up today, I want you to leave with two core things. I want you to think about the experience side of the equation. You might have the best solution in the world. If you haven't designed it to be as easy and as attractive as possible, you're just not going to have the uptake that you're looking for. And as you think about the business objectives that you have, start to define them in their behavioral components. If you can do these two things, you're well on the way to utilizing behavioral science effectively. And lastly, I have a bit of a behavioral science cheat code for you. And this single question is worth an undergraduate in behavioral science. We tend to have a core pitfall when it comes to behavioral problems. And it's we tend to think, what's missing here? What is the incentive that I need to provide? How can I persuade or nudge this person to take the action that I'm looking for? When in actual fact, it's the exact opposite. We want to think about what is the barrier that's there that's preventing that action from happening naturally. If we can remove that barrier, then we've created the very environment, the very experience to allow that behavior to happen without that need for an external motivator. If you can do these three things, you'll have been effective as a behavioral scientist. You'll be able to utilize these tools to be change leaders in your organizations. Thank you very much. And I think we should have some time for questions.
In case there are any questions, we have time for one question. You can raise your hand and we'll be happy to pass on a microphone. Can we have a mic for the gentleman right there, please? Ma'am, may I request you to please pass on the microphone to him? Sir, would request you to please introduce yourself and let's look forward to listening in.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Kishore Kapoor from TrueBiz Learning. My question to sir is, how to bring the ownership? The whole efforts are happening on sustainability. A lot of companies are talking about, a lot of governments are talking about. But when we see in city nearby, there's a little flood comes and whole system collapses. So the key thing, the behavior change is the ownership. How do you think we can bring in the ownership in a small step? Thank you.
When we think about that ownership component, and particularly within organizations, now it comes down to accountability. If you give someone that accountability as well as that ownership, you'll start to see action happen. And additionally, if we measure that accountability and that impact, and making them accountable through that, again, you will see behavior change. You will see action happen. The adage of what gets measured gets monitored and happens, same applies. And I hope that answers your question. Microphone.
Like if some organization or some stakeholder is not taking the ownership, so as a behavioral scientist, I will like to ask you, what are the 2 or 3 prompting questions we can ask which can generate the ownership from within, not from the outside? Thank you.
No worries. And this comes to kind of one of the core points around, there is a human in the center of that system. That stakeholder is a person. So if you can understand what his internal motivations are, what his objectives are, then you can start to align and get that traction from them. His objective might be, I want to get promoted in the next couple of years so I can get my pension banked and leave this organization. If you can understand what the personal motivation might be, then you might have a way to drive that traction.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for that.